Yes, welcome. I think we are good to go for a last session in a long series of policy debates organized by the Geneva Global Health Hub, or let me rather say hosted by the Geneva Global Health Hub and organized by mixed teams of members. You will see that the session that will start right now is organized by a team with corporate accountability in the lead, but many others having contributed to the effort of bringing a team together to talk about the quite sensitive topic of pandemic treaty negotiations and the role of philanthrocapitalist foundations in being there, being part of the negotiations, but also being there afterwards in the setup of a new treaty or a new convention. We have a session that is again available in various languages. You see there is an interpretation button that you can push to get access to French, Spanish, and Portuguese online interpretation. Thanks very much to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, who provided the funding to the team for having this interpretation there. If you have content issues, content questions in the follow-up, get in touch with Daniel, who is the main organizer. You see the email address on the screen, and you will find also the documentation and the recording and many other things available from tomorrow on if you get back to the website of this meeting, posted on the g2h2.org. Yes, the last one, as I told you, and the last one also that gives you the opportunity to see a bit G2H2 working. If you're a civil society organization or a civil society colleague, you're most welcome to engage also. We always are happy to have newcomers in the team, and in particular, if these newcomers come with such great contributions as this one. And here is over to the team. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas, and hello, everyone. My name is Caroline Seitz. I'm the director of the Business and Human Rights Program at Global Policy Forum, and together with my colleague Daniel Dorado, Director of Policy Organizing and Tobacco Campaign from Corporate Accountability, I will be co-moderating this policy debate on private foundations and the WHO Pandemic Treaty. In the global field of global health, we are witnessing a rapidly changing landscape of actors and increasing fragmentation in which the WHO and governments are losing influence, while new actors such as multi-stakeholder initiatives, but also private foundations are becoming more influential. In recent decades, the sector of private foundation has grown, not only in terms of number of foundations, but also with regard to their funding volume, the geographical reach, and their activities. Several super rich individuals like Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos, but also in the global south are setting up their own philanthropic foundations. Exact information on their amount of annual funding is not available because lack of transparency is a huge issue for foundations worldwide. Based on a survey among 200 foundations, the OECD estimates that these foundations donated 43 billion US dollar to development purposes in 2016 to 19. Their funding goes particularly into the area of global health, followed by education, and to the agricultural sector. Well, the financial volume is one thing, political influence is another. It is difficult to estimate the influence of the often unaccountable private foundations in terms of their capacity to influence strategic policy making in the global development agenda. And therefore, the purpose of today's panel interventions, followed by a Q&A with the audience, is to provide a policy dialogue opportunity with an array of experts and civil society actors who reflect the role of these private foundations and also the concept of philanthrocapitalism and their role during the COVID-19 crisis, as well as during the current negotiations on a WHO pandemic treaty. We also want to discuss the implications this has for human rights and sustainable development in general. Finally, this policy debate alludes to the urgent need for adoption of strong safeguards to ensure that the member state-driven nature of this very delicate diplomatic process. Such safeguard measures shall protect the process from undue influence of the private sector in all its variants. We can learn here from the first public health treaty, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. But now let's take a closer look at the great panelists we have, and I hand over to Daniel.
Thank you, Caroline, and welcome everyone to today's policy dialogue. Indeed, we are lucky to have with us so much expertise in our panel to reflect about this interesting topic. I am very pleased to welcome them and deeply thank on behalf of the convening partners of this effort, Society for International Development, Public Services International, Salud Global, AIDS Healthcare Foundation Europe, the International Association for Hospice and Palliative Care, the Global Policy Forum, and Corporate Accountability. Also, we wanted to thank the support of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for the interpretation support. With this, our panelists today, as I mentioned, bring together huge expertise, and we will have a dialogue between four panelists. Our first panelist will be Tim Schwab, an investigative journalist and author of the Bill Gates Problem. Our second panelist will be Blanca Llorente, an economist and a tobacco control expert from the ANASH Foundation from Colombia. We will also have Dr. Americo Zampetti, Ministry Counselor, Global Health and SPS Issues Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations. And our final speaker will be our dear colleague, Nicoleta Dentico, Director of Global Health Justice Program from Society for International Development, journalist, writer, and author of the books Rich and Generous, The Dark Wealth of Philanthrocapitalism, and Health Geopolitics, COVID-19, WHO, and the pandemic challenges. As probably many of you have noticed, also for today's panel, we have invited another speaker, Leonard Paller from Belt, but unfortunately, due to health reasons, he was not able to join. Nevertheless, we will be sharing through the chat box some of his most recent research. And of course, we invite all of you to take a look, and of course, as it captures your attention, to bring in at the end, in which we expect to have a really active participation. So with this, I will pass it up to you, Caroline, to start our dialogue with the panelists.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you again to all the speakers to join us for this webinar today. Many of you might start thinking and asking yourself, what is the connection between private foundations and the WHO Pandemic Treaty, or formerly called the Global Accord on Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness and Response, which is an instrument that is being negotiated since March 2020 under the auspices of WHO to protect nations and communities from future pandemic emergencies. So, to start digging on these connections, we will first have a closer look with our first speaker, Tim, on the means and tools private foundations use to shape global public policy in general. While bearing in mind that foundations are very diverse and vary in the way they are funded and governed. They differ with regard to their approaches to global development, their priorities, and their political influence and impact. We will first do this first exercise using the example of with the elephant in the room, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as this is the foundation, the far financially largest and in global policy shaping most influential private foundation. So let me first speak with our first speaker to bring the investigative journalist perspective to the discussion. And again, I also wanted to invite all participants to dropping questions into the chat box and recall that we have simultaneous interpretation into English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French. And you can find this on the globe under the icon on the Zoom bar. Tim, well, let's start with you. We are aware of your important work and research you have conducted on the Gates Foundation. You will publish a book by end of this year called The Bill Gates Problem. Can you tell us more about where exactly you see the problem and present us some means and tools Foundation used to influence public policy making? Over to you.
Sure. Thank you for this invitation and for this opportunity to talk. Just a little bit more introduction. I'm an American journalist. I've published about the Gates Foundation in The Nation, Columbia Journalism Review, and the British Medical Journal. My book coming out later this year, The Bill Gates Problem, will be published in a dozen different foreign territories, including Germany and the United Kingdom, so it'll have translation rights. So it's available for pre-sale now. So yeah, the book title is The Bill Gates Problem. And of course, we think of Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation as involved in solutions, in solving problems. And we think of it as a charity and a philanthropy. But what I argue in that, and I think maybe a lot of people on this call understand this implicitly, maybe this isn't the right audience, but the Gates Foundation isn't a charity or philanthropy. It should be understood as a political organization and a political actor. It's not going out into the world, talking to poor people, listening to their needs, trying to fulfill their desires or fulfill their dreams or give them the tools that they need for, to create the future that they want. Rather, the Gates Foundation is organized around a billionaire in Seattle's very narrow ideological ideas about, deciding what the problems are and which solutions we should solve. And fundamentally, this is a problem about democracy. It's about the ability of super rich individuals to put their hands on the levers of public policy and shape what the world looks like for the rest of us, but especially for the global poor. So for any of us that care about democracy, I think we have to understand that the Gates Foundation is a problem. It's not a solution. And the subject of today's talk is the pandemic treaty, but I'm actually going to talk about a separate issue, which may sound totally different, but I think it is related. And I think as an anecdote, it helps us understand some things about the Gates Foundation. And that's the Gates Foundation's funding of journalism and the news. So the foundation has donated more than $300 million to news outlets. And there's few newsrooms that are untouched by the Gates Foundation. So you're talking about donations to The Guardian, Al Jazeera, NPR, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, CNN, The Atlantic, El País, Financial Times, The Spectator, the BBC. Just before this call, I've noticed that the Stichting European Journalism Center seems to be receiving a lot of money from Gates, and it's $20 million. So those are some examples. Those are groups that over time have received funding from the Gates Foundation. Not all of them are currently funded by Gates, but it starts to give you a sense of how broadly Gates is funding the news media. And we have to understand that if the Gates Foundation were funding the news media as a charity, as a philanthropy, it would not be trying to compromise. It would be very conscious about not compromising the independence or the integrity of newsrooms, of journalism. So, I mean, the way that, as a journalist, that I understand journalism is that it plays an essential role in strong democracies. Journalists are, this is the American context, but called the fourth estate. It's the fourth layer of checks and balances It has an important watchdog role. There's an old saying that journalism exists to afflict the comforted and comfort the afflicted. To afflict the comforted and comfort the afflicted. And over the last 20 years, certainly over the last decade, journalism has not done that job at the Gates Foundation. It has not recognized that the foundation is a structure of power that should be scrutinized and challenged. By and large, news journalists have treated the Gates Foundation as though it were this unimpeachable charity that is beyond criticism, that is sacrosanct, that is unimpeachable in its charitable mission. And that's been a really important misunderstanding about what the Gates Foundation is and what it's doing. And the result has been a great deal of misinformation. It's grossly misinformed the public about this very important, and I would argue very malevolent actor in world affairs. Malevolent in its undemocratic, if not anti-democratic work. So again, to take this back to the foundation's funding of journalism, it's not funding journalism because the Gates Foundation believes in the democratic ideals of journalism. Everything I just laid out about the role of journalism. As I see it, the Gates Foundation is funding journalism for the exact opposite reason. It's trying to defang the watchdogs and bring them to heel. It's trying to promote an agenda and embellish a brand. It's trying to create propaganda to build political power. And it's trying to control the narrative that understands public, that guides public understanding of the Gates Foundation, if not also Bill Gates. So the way you can see this is when the Gates Foundation donates money to a newsroom, it isn't just giving it money for general operating support. It's specifying that it's to be used on a very specific topic, usually global health, sometimes education. More than that, the Gates Foundation has started imposing an editorial lens. Like, we want you to report on global health through the lens of progress by focusing on solutions, on what's working. So there's inarguably what that's doing is that's buying editorial influence over the news outlet. Now, every news outlet will tell you that taking Gates funding doesn't shape their independence, challenge their integrity at all. But I think a reasonable person using common sense can understand that the target of your investigation cannot also be the funder. If you're a newsroom taking $1 million or tens of millions of dollars from the Gates Foundation, do you have the independence to really put a hard critical lens on the work that the Gates Foundation is doing? I think most of us understand, just using common sense, that challenges your independence. Now, the argument isn't that it's impossible to challenge the Gates Foundation while taking Gates funding, but it is very difficult and it's very rare. And I think that's one important reason why. There are many reasons why perhaps journalists haven't been tougher on the Gates Foundation over the last decade or two, but I think Gates funding of journalism is one important reason. So yeah, I'm keen to just leave it there and not say too much, but we can think about the takeaways from this in terms of Gates funding in other areas. When Gates funds work in global health or is trying to get involved with the pandemic treaty or agriculture, education, is it really going in with charitable ambitions and charitable intentions under the common definition of charity, of this idea of giving away money to help people? Is that the idea, or is it really about advancing an agenda? And I think if we were to look at the Gates Foundation as a political actor and not a charity, I think that reframes the how we think about it, and maybe how we allow it into decision-making places, or how we disallow it. So my own view as a journalist, and having looked at Gates' influence over journalism and news media, is that Gates' charitable funding is totally incompatible with news gathering. That the foundation should stop funding journalism, but more than that, more importantly, newsrooms should stop accepting funding from the Gates Foundation. There are too many examples of too many places where we see bias, where we see harm, where we see misinformation from the Gates Foundation funding the news media. And I use this as an example. I think we could start thinking more broadly about saying no to the Gates Foundation's generosity, to understanding it in the proper context, that taking Gates money isn't about it isn't about empowering others. It's about empowering the Gates Foundation, the ideology it brings to the table. And, you know, we could think about a world where the richest guy doesn't have the loudest voice. At a certain point, I think we have to understand the Gates Foundation in those terms. You know, one of the richest guys in the world in Seattle, who's turned his private wealth into political power through philanthropy. To me, that is a very dangerous model to democracy, to social progress. And I think we are long overdue for a you know, really substantive public discourse, a reappraisal, and a challenge of that power and the specter of oligarchy that it presents. So I'll leave my comments there, but thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Tim. You stayed on time, and I think you opened this debate very, very well by really pointing on the problems that lie behind and this entire concept of philanthrocapitalism. I think I myself, I was aware about the Gates Foundation funding many media, news media, but I think it was very interesting to hear from you again what it is, what implication it has on the independence of journalism and the understanding of journalism itself. And I think what was very interesting too is your questioning of the role of the Gates Foundation as a charitable organization with public interests, and that you see it rather as a political organization with their own advocacy and their own private interests maybe. And I think that is really the main question, which we will also have with regard to their involvement later on in the pandemic treaty debate. And I'm sure Nicoletta will go on this topic too. Yeah, well, funding media is only one way in which large private foundations shape public policy making, direct grant making to research institutes, consulting firms, civil society organizations, and international organizations like the WHO is another one. They further create and fund global multi-stakeholder partnerships, provide matching funds for governmental programs, or place staff into public institutions. Our next speaker, Leonard, would certainly have presented us another tool, namely personal networking and direct advocacy at the highest political level. But as Daniel already told us, unfortunately, Leonard cannot join us today. With him, we wanted to go deeper into the policy area of global health because and to understand the role of foundations that which they play in the current negotiations on the pandemic treaty. It is also very important to look into their role some of these foundations have played in the past with regard to government's management of the COVID-19 crisis. Leonard and his colleagues from Politico made exhaustive research on this topic, and in particular regarding, again, on the role of the Gates Foundation, as well as on the Wellcome Trust. In their article, they traced the close relationship that Gates Foundation and Wellcome Trust had with governments and drug makers during the pandemic. And according to these the authors, the leaders of the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, Gavi and CEPI, two multi-stakeholder initiatives that these foundations have created and funded, they had really unprecedented access to highest levels of government, spending at least $8.3 million to lobby lawmakers and officials in the US and Europe. Leonard and his colleagues point on the foundation's conflict of interest, as on the one side, these foundations invested in and hold shares in pharma companies that produce COVID-19 vaccines, tests, and therapeutics, while at the same time the foundations have been very vocal and successful in their call that lifting intellectual property rights was not needed to increase vaccine supplies. Instead, their leaders helped creating voluntary multi-stakeholder initiatives like COVAX and CEPI, and as a solution for the global distribution of vaccines and therapeutics. Today we know, and independent evaluation has proven it, these multi-stakeholder initiatives have fallen short of their goals. Leonard and colleagues have further traced how these foundations and multi-stakeholder initiatives have taken over government roles in the management of pandemics, but without any democratic accountability mechanisms. We will shortly put their article into the chat, and you can read more about their research. But now over to Daniel and our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Caroline and team. What a way to kick us off and start generating several reflections on the role of private foundations and the articulation of the global policy, but in particularly on the health area. With this quick context, and as you have already addressed, Caroline, in the opening remarks, under the auspices of the World Health Organization, there is a well-known treaty that was adopted back in 2023 to address the deadly impacts of the tobacco epidemic that annually keeps killing more than 8 million people. Tobacco corporations, the main responsibility of deadly consequences of this epidemic and the health economic implications for the health systems around the world, nearly $2 trillion in economic damage, have also found a way through private foundations as a channel to undermine the safeguard provisions that this international instrument counts with to address the vested interests of the tobacco industry to participate in the development of tobacco control public health policies and to encourage state members to use their civil, criminal, and other related legislation framework to deal with this industry liability. With this short framework, it is my pleasure to welcome our second panelist, Blanca Llorente from Colombia, to broadly share some reflections on this international instrument and the implications, challenges, responses the tobacco control global community have provided to address the tobacco industry interference through the private foundations. Welcome, Blanca, and well, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. I hope you're hearing me well. My internet is a little bit unstable, but okay. Very glad to be here today. Just a quick comment about what Fundación ANASH is, where I work, since I'm going to refer to another foundation, but of a different nature. I think it's important to clarify. Fundación ANASH is an NGO based in Colombia. We have been working for 10 years to do research and research to policy activities to promote sustainable development. And one of our main areas of action is tobacco control policies in the context of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control that Daniel has already explained briefly. So my comments are going to be from the experience from the ground as an organization that is witness of the effects of a foundation that is entirely funded by one of the main tobacco companies in the world, that is Philip Morris, and how that creates additional ethical problems, governance, and many of the issues that have been mentioned during this panel in terms of misinformation, undermining democratic institutions, and so on and so forth. So hopefully this would provide some insights that are relevant for a wider discussion on how we fund public health and how we make improve accountability during the whole process of policy design and implementation and the whole decision-making process altogether. So briefly, Fundación ASH is funded almost entirely by international cooperation funds that may come directly or indirectly by several channels of philanthrocapitalism, not the Smoke-Free World Foundation from Philip Morris, but from others. So I have to be completely transparent about that. So many of the comments before resonate, and I think they challenge organizations like ours in terms of how to maintain our independent view. It certainly is a challenge. So I acknowledge that. So moving on to Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. When did it start? In 2018, Philip Morris International make a bold statement announcing that they will invest $80 million annually over the next 12 years, supposedly with the purpose of making a contribution to the health challenge that the tobacco pandemic means to the world. In reality, as was a comment before regarding the Gates Foundation, this is a political tool. This is a political actor that acts on behalf of the interests of its single funding source, which is Philip Morris International. And how does it operate? The main focus is to change the narrative in two ways. First, to give the message that they know better. They know better that public health practitioners that had trying to do their job for decades. Now that they come up with a solution to the tobacco pandemic, a supposed solution. We are allies, not your enemy. And this is a narrative that is very clever because, as Daniel was mentioning, in the case of tobacco control, we have a governance system that is defined by this international treaty that we call the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. The FCTC, is a mechanism that is very powerful because it clarifies the goals that we have in terms of public policy to reduce the tobacco consumption and its impacts. It also prevents, through specific commitment, to keep the industry away from the policy design and implementation and just be the object of regulation in Article 5.3, which is a big milestone. And of course, the device of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World is cleverly designed precisely to challenge this article. So again, no, we are not your enemies. You cannot isolate us from the conversation. We want to be part of the solution and we want to be part of the conversation. So this is an attempt to gain the law's social license, the acceptance and the credibility and the reputation. This is an attempt. So far, partially successful, but if we don't do something about it, they will succeed. And also the other mechanism that they work with is the creation of networks. Obviously, these $80 million that every year they announce, they are channeling those resources through grants, funding allies, and creating a very intricate network of collaboration it's very, very difficult to track. It's not transparent. So sometimes you may be in the ground speaking to some organization that directly or indirectly is funded by this foundation. And obviously you will identify them by their deeds, not necessarily by what they say, but what they do. In parallel, Philip Morris the company, created, launched, and this is not by chance, their heated tobacco products line. Again, an attempt to wash their reputation. So it's very clever. They have the philanthropic branch and they have the production branch, faking the commitment to public health. In fact, they remain one of the main sellers of conventional cigarettes in the world. So don't fool yourselves. It's not a change of business. It's just a change of strategy. Well, moving forward finally to my next point is, how do they operate in Colombia? Not directly that we know of. Again, it's a network of collaborators, indirectly through a network that is called INCO, the International Network of Nicotine Consumers. And this is another layer in the narrative that is very difficult to deal with. These allies do not present themselves as the typical front group that defends, or legitimate group even, of producers' associations. What they present themselves is as consumer rights advocates. We defend the rights of consumers in a very narrow, cherry-picking strategy, using the human rights speech in their favor. So what they say is, we need consumer rights to prevail, regardless of other rights that are put in danger. So the use of consumers associations to discredit policies.
Les associations de consommateurs pour discréditer les politiques.
I am listening to the French interpreter.
J'entends l'interprétation française, dit l'oratrice.
Don't know why. Okay.
Il n'est pas interprète.
Okay. So finally, what they do, these allies, is not only, present this image that they are defending consumer rights, but also that they discredit the policies that we know work. Basically, in Colombia, what they have done is attacked tobacco taxation, and they have challenged any attempt to pass a protective regulation regarding electronic cigarettes. So finally, I will leave you with this idea. This is an issue of how we fund public policy, and in particular, health policy. Tobacco control certainly is largely underfunded. The organizations like mine that work in this area depend largely on international cooperation funds. Many of us would be tempted even to take funds from this organization, from PMI. And actually, I know attempts in Colombia of reaching out to organizations that have worked in tobacco and in related areas. But most importantly, what we need is to discuss the issue of how do we channel local funding from the public sector and make sure that we have the governance, rule of law, institutional conditions to make sure that this funding is used wisely in the best buys that are going to create a greater impact. I think that's the core of the discussion that we need to get at. So thank you. I hope this is helpful to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Blanca. Indeed, very pertinent and really insightful example on ways these transnational corporations try to constantly influence the global policy agenda, in particularly with the tobacco industry, the health agenda. And I just want to build from something that you mentioned, and how on an item related on how this foundation operates, the Smoke-Free World Foundation. I'm dropping on the chat box a statement from WHO from 2017, as they were starting aware of when this foundation started to operate. And I will not go to read all the statement. I hope that you can, while I am speaking, start reading through it. But you will see several calls. So for instance, it captures my attention that definitely WHO was very firmly addressed that they will not engage with the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. Also, they make some references regarding the importance of continue implementing by governments the provisions of the Global Health Treaty. And well, they also make some references on how this foundation is basically vaguely funded by Philip Morris International. So in order to start making the transition to start connecting the roles of private foundations and the discussion on the pandemic treaty, well, I will just to drop a question on the table. No, why the WHO organization and the United Nations system is so firmly when we are dealing with a corporation or a transnational corporation such as the tobacco industry, and of course it is because there exists a strict policy of non-engagement with tobacco industry actors at the World Health Organization. But why, when we are discussing broader topics, these strictness do not seem as firmly when it regards to open the door to several non-state private actors. So with that, I will leave it there and will pass the floor to Caroline so that she can continue the dialogue and start making the transition and connecting the dots with the pandemic treaty discussions on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Blanca and Daniel. I think we have a lot to learn,
Merci,
learn from...
merci. Je crois que c'était effectivement...
Okay, we have still problems with the audio and interpretation.
Il semble qu'il y ait des problèmes d'audio.
Let's see if they...
On t'entend sur
can
le
mute them.
Italie.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Daniel and Blanca, for your intervention.
Merci beaucoup.
We can once again.
Non, arrête Mireille, je reprends.
French interpreters, we hear you on the English channel. Please check your channel and adapt it. Thank you.
Thanks.
L'interprète est sur le canal français.
Once again. Can you mute yourself, please? In the English channel? Okay, let's try. Okay, so let's come directly to our next panel speakers.
Passons à l'intervenant suivant.
Dentico and Dr. Americo Zampetti, who will bring us closer to the debates we have with regard to the pandemic treaty.
Au débat concernant le traité.
Sorry, I have to interrupt again. There, can I maybe all the participants change if you cannot resolve this, change the channel to your language, or change it to English. Because we still hear the French interpretation in parallel to the original one. So French interpreters, please look what's going wrong there, and please try to look that your interpretation is not heard in the English channel. Thank you.
Okay, let's try it again. So our two final speakers will now update us on the current status of the pandemic treaty negotiations, and they will also share their perception of the WHO call that they want to have an all-of-society approach in the drafting process and the participation of all relevant stakeholders. And they can also share their views on the implications of the involvement of private foundations for the negotiation of the future pandemic treaty and its adoption. So let's start now with Dr. Americo Zampetti. Can you share, please, your impressions on the pandemic treaty negotiations and the role of so-called stakeholders, or in the language of WHO, non-state actors, which include civil society, academic institutions, but also private companies and private foundations. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks for the interesting dialogue so far. The negotiation on the pandemic agreement has been ongoing for some time, and we are now getting a little bit more into the textual discussions. The modalities for civil society participation were set early in the process, and they are sort of traditional modalities which see participation of civil society somewhat limited to the open session and somewhat restricted in terms of the negotiating session where the text is drafted or proposals are discussed. There are also some limitation in access to documents, and is an approach that is fairly sort of common in many UN processes. Now, from our perspective, we see no reason to have any particular restriction. We said it publicly that we would be happy to have a fully open participation of civil society in the discussion, and we also do not see any reason to keep documentation sort of restricted. And indeed, we post all our proposals on the website of the European Union delegation to the UN. So we have no particular problem whatsoever in terms of transparency and in terms of participation of civil society in the discussion. Now, that is our perspective. It is not necessarily shared. And unfortunately, the agreement was at the outset of the process, as I said, to have a fairly traditional and somewhat restricted access for civil society in the discussion. We see an important role for civil society in supporting the negotiation, to providing additional analysis, additional input, and we very much welcome the reaching out to us directly of civil society, since they cannot participate necessarily in informal discussion at WHO. They are much welcome to come to us directly. We also see an important role for civil society in terms of the possible future implementation of the agreement. Hopefully we will get to an agreement, and the proposal we have made see the recognition of that, and we indeed propose to have strong ties of a future conference of the parties with civil society, as well as a large role for expert and scientific inputs again down the line when it will come to implement the agreement. Of course, civil society will have also a larger role than also in the implementation on the ground, not just the implementation via the institutional machinery of the agreement, but implementation on the ground of a number of important provisions of the agreement, be that in the area of course, prevention, preparedness, and response to future pandemic situation. So, just to summarize, we are fully transparent. We see the value of transparency. We see the value of civil society participation, and we welcome such participation and such input across the board. When it comes to the private sector, we also see an important role that the private sector can play in a number of areas. Of course, scientific research immediately comes to mind. We also see, of course, the potential complexities that private sector may bring. Nonetheless, we are clearly interested in ensuring that there is an appropriate sort of input that the private sector can make in the discussion. To be honest, so far, we have received no particular solicitation from the private sector in this discussion, so we are totally fine. But were they to come to us to discuss, we will also will be open to discuss with them as well. We think that, of course, when it comes to response to pandemic, you have a number of areas where the contribution of the private sector becomes quite important, because it will be a matter of producing certain particular type of countermeasures or pandemic-related products that are particularly crucial in ensuring an effective response to pandemic situations. So it is clear that the private sector is an element that is in some cases vital importance in an effective and equitable response to pandemic. So it will remain important to have a useful and frank dialogue with them as well. We have put forward some important proposal in the area of response, which consider the need to ensure a larger sort of a more sort of a deeper equity in terms of the way countermeasure pandemic-related products are made available in different countries. So we have made proposal that try to ensure that there will be a number of pricing guidelines for pandemic related products, and in particular price caps at non-for-profit level when it comes to making available countermeasures for the low-income countries. So we have made proposal that I think will have an impact in the way the private sector is asked to behave, and we trust that the private sector will see the importance of such provisions, and again, we will remain, of course, open to discuss with them during the next weeks and months in the negotiation. But so far, we have not had the chance or the pleasure to discuss with them in any particular details, but I'm sure it will come. I guess I'll leave it at that for the moment, and thanks again for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amerigo Sampetti, for sharing your view on the modalities of engagement of the various actors in the pandemic treaty process, as well as your perception of their role for the future implementation of the treaty. Well, you related mainly on civil society actors and private sector. Now, not very much stating where you see private foundations fitting in. But maybe we can discuss this later in the Q&A and discussion part. So then let's move to our final speaker, Nicoletta Dentico. I think you have the final words. You have been very vocal and worked a lot on a concept that may not be familiar with all of us, and the concept of philanthrocapitalism. You have been writing some articles and a book on this concept. And you have been also following the current treaty debates very closely. And yeah, I'm looking forward to hear your impression of this debate, and also with regard to the role philanthropic private foundations have in this entire treaty debate, and how they shape it. Over to you, Nicoletta.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you for the opportunity to speak in this very important policy dialogue. I also want to recognize the importance of the speakers before me, whose comments I would like to use as my kind of, jumping pad for what I want to say. And actually, I would like to start from your last question, Caroline. Where do you place private foundations in between civil society and the corporate private sector? That's a first important question in this kind of open source anarchy in which we see the global health scenario being progressively, designed, especially over the last 20 years, but with a very important acceleration, I think, during and after the pandemic. It is a blurred arena where and almost quite completely deregulated, although of course the WHO has tried with the FENSA agreement, with the FENSA negotiation, to bring a little bit of rules of the game. But we also know how particularly the philanthropic foundations, the private foundation and the Gates Foundation in the specific case are actually easily bypassing the FENSA agreement. For example, paying for people that are actually working at the WHO, paying directly these people instead of going through some of the FENSA rules. And this is accepted by the WHO Secretariat and the director. So the situation is pretty blurred in a scenario where private foundations are not at all charity entities, but as Tim said at the beginning, political actors, political players. That is absolutely the case. In a way, this has always been the case. I mean, if you look at the role of the Rockefeller Foundation in the 20th century into the setting some of the preliminary concept of the very WHO, the World Health Organization, this has always been the case. I mean, private entities and private foundations have really been crucial throughout the history of the WHO. The problem is that now we have come to a moment, to a point of not only their role increasing, but also their number increasing and their internal interaction being increasingly, in a way, entangled on the one hand and ungraspable on the other. I will try to elaborate on this a little bit more. When Amerigo Zampetti says that we have not received any specific solicitation from the private sector in relation to the WHO pandemic accord, I think he says something that is certainly true, because we are not, I think, at the stage of the negotiation when the private sector will, come on board directly. But in a way, he's also, in my view, alluding to the fact that the private sector the corporate private sector doesn't really need to go to governments today, because there's someone else that actually prepares the terrain for the WHO pandemic negotiation to take a certain turn that will be intrinsically favorable to the corporate private sector. And that is certainly the case for pharma companies. We have written, we wrote a report as a Geneva Global Health Hub in 2021 when we were trying to dig into the origin, the genesis of this pandemic treaty. And we were actually making a research hypothesis grounded also on our respondents that the pandemic treaty was the place where to institutionalize the mechanics that were negotiated in alternative to the possibility of an IP waiver, okay? So that the WHO should be the place where the solutionism created by governments and with a strong pressure of the private foundations, as the important wealth and political investigation has revealed, would be kind of harbored and sealed in a UN institution. The WHO is the ground for making this happen. And in that respect, I find rather, in a way, I find rather naive the perception of those that are imagining to gain at the WHO was what has not been, we have not been able to gain at the WTO, which is a TRIPS waiver, a temporary suspension of intellectual property rights, as, by the way, provided by international law by the very WTO. So in a way, the private foundations are playing this brokering function. They are the brokering, the powerful brokers that are that have since the last 25 years at least reconfigured the public health discourse. They have in a way confirmed a certain hierarchy of powers and players, and a certain way of looking at the health agenda. It is particularly serious, and I think it is in a way very sad that this should happen after 3 years of an emergency like COVID-19, which, and it is a kind of a bit, you know, strange to see all these negotiators talking about the COVID lessons, except that all the COVID lessons are systematically denied or completely neglected in the solutions that are being designed. When we consider that the WHO negotiation is currently only looking at producing pandemic-related products and actually looking at preparedness and response, where the word prevention is gone completely, and there is no real measure for preventing the future pandemics, although we know it would cost less, it would actually be more, more functional, more effective from a public health response. This is happening precisely because the private foundations are pushing for this agenda together with their corporate players, their corporate allies. They embody, private foundations are a very sophisticated way of the corporate sector to really strengthen its presence and to strengthen its influence, political influence in global policy making. I will make of course, this the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have actually, you know, opened the pathway for this, but they have not been the first. The first one has been Ted Turner with the UN Foundation, for example, Global Policy Forum. You know very well, Caroline has actually, you know, torn the veil of how the UN Foundation started in 1998 in the UN, actually sitting at the General Secretary's office with staff that actually participates regularly in the Secretary General meetings, but only to be in a way formalized in 2015 by the members of the UN, okay? So the UN Foundation, which is extremely powerful because it is now actually measuring with the digital partnership on sustainable development, it's measuring the performance of each individual state in achieving the sustainable development goals, has in a way, created its sister foundation in the WHO, with the WHO Foundation, whose original role was to help the WHO raise funds for its impoverished cash. But in fact, it's now playing a fundamental role, the WHO Foundation, in kicking off processes at the WHO, mediating processes, accompanying WHO delegations to countries for the provision of services. The WHO Foundation is not only the sister of the UN Foundation, but is also an extremely important player. It goes around the world with the UN Foundation to basically advise governments on which policy priorities should be, opted for, perhaps neglecting others, and therefore this is another player that is extremely important. But I certainly.
May I ask you to come to your final minute, please? Thank you. You are muted now. Nicoletta, you are muted. You can just give your final sentences and then.
I would like to just go back 1 second to the Gates Foundation, because of course it is by definition, I mean, it's an objective statement. It's an evidence-based statement, is the big elephant in the global health room. Of course, the Gates Foundation is very directly involved in health, food, climate, and finance. All of this, we don't have time to elaborate, are closely related to health. But what I would like to mention is that with, in a way, governments' complicity, governments' indifference or ignorance or, basically complacency, the Gates Foundation has been able to introduce CropLife International as one of the actors in official relationship with the WHO when it was rejected at FAO at the beginning, and is now, of course, the one foundation that is pumping quite a lot of money in lots of think tanks to promote a certain direction, a certain sense of direction of the WHO pandemic accord, and preventing that the notion of prevention policies to avoid the future pandemics should be introduced in the negotiations seriously, because of course this would impact very seriously with the food and agricultural agenda of the foundation and all the legacy of corporate players that are in CropLife International and that are in the AGRA public and private partnership that the Gates Foundation is moving. So there is how shall I say, an entanglement of interests that are impacting on the governance and the public policy outcome we will see with the pandemic accord. And unlike the US government at the end of the 19th century, which was very aware of the threats coming from billionaires getting involved in public policing, today, the disheartening comment is that we see governments absolutely, unaware or indifferent or complacent with the threatening role that private foundations have, even in terms of government legitimacy and government capacity to, exercise its obligation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicoletta. I see. You have a lot to say, and thank you very much for connecting the dots and also sharing your knowledge about other foundations around the WHO, like the UN Foundation, the WHO Foundation, etc., as well as for showing us how the influence of private foundation is reflected in the current pandemic treaty, mainly by the current focus of the negotiations on biomedical solutions, while the preventative part is kind of neglected. Yeah, so, but now we have still some time for discussion, for Q&A, and we are happy to yeah, go to this discussion part. Yeah, Dr. Americo Zampetti, you raised your voice.
And sorry, I raised my hands because I was very interested by the remarks of Nicoletta, and I must say that while I think the narrative that she articulates is plausible and maybe is taking place in other contexts, and I cannot comment on that. I do not see that narrative playing out currently in the negotiation of the pandemic agreement. What I see in the negotiation of the pandemic agreement is a very strong interest, not interest, a very strong emphasis, I would say, of the European Union in the prevention part, where we have put extensive proposals on the table that, as I said, since we value transparency, we have put on the EU delegation website, and I would encourage colleagues that may be interested in the details to look up. So we have put extensive proposal in the area of prevention, and in terms of trying to pursue and promote a One Health approach, and we have seen, unfortunately, some pretty significant reluctance from colleagues coming from delegation of if I can use the term, broadly speaking, of developing countries, that seems to perceive One Health or the prevention side of the debate as something that may turn out to be too expensive or too demanding, and have a very distinct focus on the response side. Now, we believe the response side is also very important, and as I said, we are trying to ensure that profit making is something that is not the sort of the lodestar of these negotiations, and we have made a very specific proposal that speaks to the notion that there should be no profit when selling pandemic-related products, what we call generally medical countermeasures, in low-income countries. And there should be set aside quantities of such products to ensure that such products are both available and affordable in the next pandemic. God forbid there is one. We hope there isn't, obviously. But if there is one, we think that we should not repeat, and we should learn from the lessons that we unfortunately had to endure during the COVID-19 situation. So I wanted to make it very clear that we take prevention extremely seriously. Actually, it's one of the main priorities. And unfortunately, it is misunderstood as sort of a kind of a luxury to do prevention, and what it counts is only response. And I think it's a really faulty approach. And we hope that the end result, the outcome of the negotiation, will be more in line with the approach we are promoting, because we really think that is the one that would make a good difference on the ground. Now, in all of that, I don't see any role for the foundations per se. They have not come to us. We would certainly, kindly listen to them if they do come to us. But at the moment, I don't see any interest from them into this negotiation. Now, I hope it's not because they consider the negotiation to be totally irrelevant and not worth their time. I hope that is not the case. But I just report what the situation is, at least from our side. We have had no lobbying or other input coming from the philanthropic sector, which we would see as a possible provider of an earmark funding if down the line, we have a significant financial mechanism that should accompany this agreement. So I want to leave it at that for the moment, but I thought it was important to clarify this point. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Americo, and definitely that's the idea, that panelists can interact and express your point of views, and definitely, well, the intention is that we can continue expanding, and that, well, that everyone that is involved on this process can continually and proactively continue advocating for definitely strong safeguard measures that hopefully could land into some of the scenarios that you are addressing, that delegations firmly address the commitment to transparency, but also that all voices could be here, and that the voices that are there could be the ones that definitely needs to be seen, because in the experience of the tobacco control treaty negotiations, there were several attempts from the tobacco industry to constantly find a seat on the table through foundations, through other actors, and definitely most of the spirit is to continue protecting the negotiations. I'm sure that Nicoleta will love to probably react, but considering that we are aware that other attendees may have some other questions or reactions, and always the time it is so short, and we apologize that time is not always as long as we envision to hear reactions, but we have more or less 10 minutes. So our suggestion with Caroline is that attendees can open your mics, raise your hands. We can collect a couple of interventions and try to synthesize into a concrete question for the panelists, and hopefully they can react shortly to your comments or questions, and we will save some time so that Nicoleta can also react to what Dr. Americo shared. With this, well, I will kindly ask if anyone from our distinguished audience is willing to share any reflection or address a particular question to all the panelists or to a particular panelist. Just please raise your hand, and as possible, if you feel comfortable opening your video, well, that will also be helpful for the dynamic of the dialogue. For the moment, I am not seeing any hands. So let's give a couple of minutes while attendees raise. Yes, I see one hand from Raymond Sanner. Please go ahead. And thanks for bringing your perspective. Raymond, can you please open your mic? Not sure Thomas is.
Yeah, now it works.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. I'd like to point out the following. We have researched on the philanthropic organizations and foundations. And at the moment, there is also a discussion at the UN level to give philanthropic organizations the status of a stakeholder group. You know, there are the 9 major groups, and then come the stakeholder groups, which was interrupted during the COVID period. But there is serious discussion to elevate and invite philanthropic organizations to take the floor. So that hasn't been sufficiently yet discussed also within the NGO community, what this would mean. But that's one point I wanted to make. The other one is, I think we shouldn't underestimate how some private sector companies are able to simply talk to their governments who take up their priorities. So it's not necessarily visible, as Nicoleta mentioned before about Gavi and SEPs being sitting at the table. That's clear. But some of the private sector influencing mechanisms goes indirectly through the governments, maybe where they have their headquarters. So it's not visible. We don't know. And it's more difficult to figure out, or maybe we can deduct why some key governments don't want a binding agreement on TRIPS, because probably internally they have discussions with some of their economic corporations. But to get to that data is difficult. So I'd like to know also from Americo, how do you scan, or let's say, keep an eye on where the influencing comes from? Because when the delegate of a country who is in the room and at the table says no, that maybe is not just that person's own personal opinion, but there's a whole network behind that you maybe are not able to reach or to influence. What do you do with the network influencing that is probably happening all the time? That was what I wanted to say, and thanks for an excellent session. I've been listening attentively.
Thank you so much, Raymond, for your participation and your question. We have been taking note. I also noticed that Hanshi Yu was raising a hand.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, hello. I'm a visiting scholar in Geneva Graduate Institute. Yeah, I really appreciate everyone's talk, and I just want to ask a question. Is I think the first panelist mentioned a very interesting idea that whether we should regard the Bill Gates Foundation as a political actor or a charitable actor when we're talking about these issues. So my question is, because today I think we're all talking about the perspective, actor perspective. So my question is, when we're talking about specific issue area in global health governance, so in your idea, what kind of specific issue area that, for example, like these foundations, they could have the similar agenda with the public sectors, but whether on the other specific issue areas, their agenda could be conflicting with each other. So my question is whether whether it's possible to divide the global health issue as the specific different issues, then we can better identify what should be the role of this kind of foundations in global health. I hope my question is clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanshi. We will do the best to try to articulate. And I think that in honor of the time, we can receive one more question from Pai Rundal, and then definitely we will need to make a time balance issue to be able to address and hear from the panel.
Okay,
Go ahead,
so
Pai.
very quickly, thanks. I wasn't able to hear the whole of this. Sorry, I'm in Canada for the Codex meeting. And it's just such an important thing. I'm speaking from, I was IBFAN, and the Gates Foundation in particular is a huge problem for us. And as Nicoletta and others know, it's because they are focused in on the breastfeeding and infant feeding, which has confused everybody. Everybody thinks, oh, well, that must be marvelous that they've done that. But in fact, they've twisted it round so that it's pushed WHO into this real dilemma where they work in that way of actually working with the private sector. In fact, WHO has been really trying very hard to keep the code and keep all the restrictions that we have been working for. But the pressure is enormous. And in our case, it's to do with the scaling up nutrition, which is a massive problem, because that is all over the world. Is wherever you have the scaling up nutrition, all funded by Gates, all pushed by Gates and the other philanthropies, the governments are thinking they must legislate in collaboration with companies and corporations. It's a real problem. So I'm really delighted that you've done this thing. I'd listened to Tim Schwab's in particular talking about the funding of journalists as well, which absolutely scares the life out of me. And I think it's something that we haven't addressed at all properly. everybody. So I'm really pleased. Thank you. It wasn't a clear question, but I just wanted you to know we're with you, and thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you, Patty. That's also the idea, to hear the reactions, to see the insights that this webinar has bring to all of you, and that we can continue the dialogue. Definitely the conversation do not end here. The negotiation rounds of the pandemic treaty are on track. So definitely all the insights that can come from everyone are always welcome. So I have been in conversations with our dear colleague Thomas from G2H2 to see how we can address and how panelists can interact to some of the reactions that have been made. He mentions that we can go for a couple of minutes, but this doesn't mean that we'll have like another half an hour. So my proposal to panelists is that you can briefly react. I will try to synthesize the questions that have been made, and as you consider appropriate, you react. And also, Nicoletta, I will invite if as part of your comments you want to specifically address what Americo brought regarding your insights or any additional reaction. After that, well, Caroline will kindly close the webinar. I'm very sad that we do not have more time, but definitely, well, knowing that the excitement of this discussion, for sure there will be other spaces that I'm sure G2H2 will continue creating to motivate and continue the debate. So to try to synthesize the questions, Raymond was bringing a specific question to Dr. Americo, but others, if you want to react, basically, if I got it right, and of course, I know that you have been paying attention to the question, but basically he was addressing how definitely the Gates Foundation has been involved or is involved in the negotiations, and what are some type of measures that could be taken as part of the engagement with private foundations, the Bill Gates Foundations, and other private actors that could be addressed. Also, Hansi, you brought some questions, and I think they were in some way particularly addressed to Tim in the way private foundations influence the global policy agenda, and what are some of the contentious items that they try to pay attention and what could be done. And well, from Patty's interventions, I will just bring that definitely there is a concern that, as probably as Caroline was pointed in her opening remarks, an elephant in the room that needs to be addressed, and probably will be great to hear any reaction from the panelists. What are some of the suggestions to advance or adopt strong safeguard measures that, among others, avoids the role of some vested interest from this type of actors? I will leave it there. I hope I make justice to the comments that were made. Well, I will not point any of the panelists. I will just encourage, if anyone has any reactions, please open your mic and kick us off, and then I will see which other of the panelists raise their hands to give a final closing remarks.
Hey, am I on? Yeah, so I'll just be really briefly. I know we're running out of time. I think the second question, it seemed to be asking whether we could or should think about Gates' influence and separate it out between different public policies it works on. I'm not sure I completely understood that question, but I don't think that I probably misunderstood the question, but that doesn't make sense to me. I think you can understand the Gates Foundation's, its influence and power the same in every venue it goes into. It should be understood in the same way. And we've kind of talked a lot about money and power. So I just wanted to make this point. I don't know if this is helpful to any of the questions, but the Gates Foundation comes to public policy initiatives with a real ideological perspective, which is that of Bill and Melinda Gates, who were Microsoft executives, founders. So, that means their solution, their approaches are about, the primacy of the private sector, neoliberalism, intellectual property. It has an ideological, drive to the work it does. But it is also important and worthwhile to talk about the finances of the Gates Foundation, which is donating very large sums of money to pharmaceutical companies. It's making charitable donations to these companies. And the Gates Foundation's endowment, its trust, in its most recent tax filing, it was $54 billion, which is invested in anything and everything. So there's always a question about governance and conflicts of interest. Is should somebody who has a financial investment in a given public policy issue, should they be at the decision-making table? Should they be able to influence the decisions that are going to affect their bottom line? I'm not arguing that Bill Gates runs the Gates Foundation to become richer, to make money. That's not the point. The point is a simple matter of propriety and good governance, of conflicts of interest and how you manage these. And as far as I can see, in most of the venues where the Gates Foundation works, we don't pay attention to those issues because it comes in wearing the superhero cape of philanthropy, and we just assume, well, this is a charity. It has good intentions. We shouldn't look askance at a billionaire giving away all of his money. That is a naive and I think a dangerous perspective to take. And I think that's an entry point to rethink globally Gates' role in these different areas.
Thank you so much, Tim. Very insightful remarks. Any other of the panelists want to react?
If I may, Daniel, I will take some time to just thank Dr. Zampetti for his comments. Of course, we don't have time to elaborate, and the point is not, here to. I'm fully aware of the EU focus on One Health. That's I think the topic of another webinar at another time. But overall, I think that everyone is pushing towards preparedness and response, which is precisely the way that you have depicted, the core business of the WHO accord, basically producing products, producing drugs, remedies, countermeasures. Let's put it this way, which is by far from being, a political public health focused solution to facing the future pandemics. And we see that also in the way, AMR is being tackled at the moment only in terms of R&D and new antibiotics, which of course are important, but are not actually looking at the systemic root causes of AMR. So anyway, this is another webinar, I guess. Of course, the tentacular presence and in a way the problem of this benevolent dictatorship of the Gates Foundation has to do a lot also with the proliferation of a lot of public and private partnerships that are the brainchild of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. As I said, if there is any meaning in the body positioning, in the body language of the treaty negotiation at the WHO, we see that this CEPI and Gavi are sitting like and speaking like member states. These are a manifestation of private foundations through their creatures now. And of course, the scene is getting more and more complicated by the year. Now we have, we were talking about this in the previous webinar, this super PPP or, that has been created with ACT Accelerator, with COVAX. So the situation is getting more and more complicated, and in a way, more and more distant from any democratic control of who is making decisions according to which criteria and on which grounds, which is basically what Tim was talking about the democratic threat that these foundations are creating. Finally, of course, as long as principle and values and strategies of the corporate sector are imposed and are vehicled, channeled in the policy arena, as we see today, there are two issues here. The global public health discourse is constantly being depoliticized. Of course, this solutionism, which is exactly the same thing that is the solution journalism that Gates found. This solutionistic approach is not looking at the determinants of health and the complexification of the determinants of health. And the second problem is that, of course, philanthrocapitalism and these foundations, for that matter, they thrive in inequality. I mean, as I happen to, write in my book, the amniotic liquid of philanthropy and foundations like the Gates Foundation is the structural inequalities in which we are, which combined with the depoliticization of the discourse on health and food systems and climate and finance is the perfect scenario for these foundations to thrive. I think we have a major problem that we will have to face because it is the public function here which is at stake. And of course, they are very cunning. They don't need to come to the core of the negotiation at the WHO now, but we know that they are extremely present. The Gates Foundation is extremely present in the World Bank fora and the IFC now in order to design the financing around the pandemic solutions and the pandemic strategies that are to be, featured for the future. So they are also extremely tentacular, and because they are tentacular, they can be present without being perceived as present, which is an increasing factor to their to the threat that they pose. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicoletta. Really, really insightful. Also, well, Thomas has kindly plugged in me that we need to close, but I want at least to give 1 minute to Blanca and Dr. Americo to one final comment if you wish. And after that, I will pass it to Caroline to close. Please, Blanca.
Yeah, I just want to leave the panel with an idea, not to open a future discussion, but I think the key word here is governance, empowerment of grassroots organizations as well, with legitimate representation of the communities. And regardless of the source of funding, of course, I agree that this is a huge problem, the philanthrocapitalism, because of the size, the sheer size. But even if we are discussing public funds, that would also be an issue in terms of making sure that funding is allocated to the priorities that the communities need to be addressed. So again, going back to governance tools, one of the key issues.
Thank you, Blanca. Really good point. And Dr. Americo, you have any final closing remarks?
Yes, no, I mean, I really need to emphasize once more that the characterization of the negotiation as to focus on preparedness response is, I must say, is not accurate, at least in terms of the perspective of the union. We have made extremely clear that no agreement that does not address prevention would be an agreement worth having. So that is our position, and I don't think we can, unless we want to sort of excise completely the participation of the union in these negotiations, we cannot characterize the current debates and discussion as one that focus on preparedness and response only. Those are very important, but prevention is as important. And indeed, in the proposal that we have made, we have included an annex on antimicrobial resistance, which runs, I guess, more than 6 pages, which goes through a whole set of provisions that once more have to do a lot with prevention. So I would just want to stress that, not to leave any of the listener the wrong impression that we are in the business of creating an agreement that focus on the production of countermeasure, be those as important as they are, of course. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much. I think that is a really good way to close, and I will pass it to Caroline for the closing remarks, and we can transition to finalize our dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. And I see we should really continue this discussion, maybe in another T2H2 webinar. especially with regard also to discuss measures to limit the private sector and foundations' influence. I now want to thank especially the audience for their active participation, the speakers for their very important input and contribution, my great co-moderator Daniel, who was key in organizing this event, then Thomas Schwarz from G2H2 for the technical support, Neha Gupta from SID for the communication support, and of course also the interpreters. I think that was very, very important to have them with us. Yeah, so thank you all, and see you for our next discussion on this topic, I'm sure.
Thank you all.